Nothing new to report.
2010 marked a turning point for the Splinter Cell franchise. Up to this stage there had been two great entries, being the original Splinter Cell and Chaos Theory, the latter of which still holds up as one of the best stealth games ever made, then a decent game, Pandora Tomorrow, and a pretty bad one, Double Agent. The series alternated development teams between Ubisoft Montreal and Ubisoft Shanghai, with Splinter Cell and Chaos Theory being made by the A team of Ubisoft Montreal. Conviction saw the franchise back in the reliable hands of Ubisoft Montreal, so hopes were high for a return to form. Most fans would have been happy with a game like Chaos Theory updated for the new generation of consoles. That is absolutely not what they got. Splinter Cell Conviction is unrecognisable as a Splinter Cell game. Double Agent might have been a broken mess depending on which version you played, but it still fit the tagline of stealth action redefined that accompanied the release of the original game. Conviction is simply action redefined, although unsurprisingly that never featured on the box art. To state the obvious, different is not always bad. The Fallout games started as isometric experiences with turn-based combat, but New Vegas showed that you can absolutely have a faithful Fallout experience in first person with real-time combat. When compared to Fallout 4, we can see that what is important to Fallout is not the view or the combat, but the experience. The feeling of wandering a post-apocalyptic wasteland with the freedom to make choices that define your experience in ways you can't predict. Replacing all those interesting dialogue choices with yes, no, maybe and sarcastic has much more impact than changing the viewpoint through which you experience the action. Likewise with Splinter Cell, change can be good, especially if it is additive. Conviction has some entertaining set-piece moments, the cutscenes have drastically improved and the combat is now far smoother, so if you do get into a gunfight you feel relatively well equipped to deal with it. It's also almost completely bug-free, which I wouldn't usually highlight except that I've just played Double Agent, so this feels like a miracle by comparison. However, those improvements don't count for much when so much has been stripped out. Levels are now almost entirely linear, not to mention incredibly short, and you have so little freedom of approach that you often feel like you're playing on autopilot. In short, Conviction is not a stealth game. The drastic changes made to the gameplay style were largely part of a Ubisoft mandate to make the games appeal to a wider audience. Stealth games are a bit like horror games in that they are often highly regarded with passionate fan bases and critical acclaim, and yet they don't sell as many copies as publishers think necessary. Ironically though, Conviction was actually going to be an even more radical departure for the franchise, but Ubisoft got scared by early press and fan reactions, and forced Ubisoft Montreal back to the drawing board to create something a bit more familiar. There's just no pleasing some people. Splinter Cell Conviction was originally slated for release around Christmas 2007, but didn't end up getting released until spring of 2010. Clearly something went wrong. At E3 2007, Ubisoft started showing the game to press, and the reaction wasn't what it hoped for. Once reporters started publishing press releases to the masses, it quickly became clear that fans were not overly enamoured with the drastically different approach the series appeared to be taking. From the footage available online, the game did look to be most of the way complete, although we only saw one level, so perhaps it was an Anthem smoke and mirrors situation. There were some bugs, but E3 was a press-only event back then, and the media didn't tend to freak out about such things in early builds.
Wow. As you can see, it is an early build, so I'm just gonna, whack on.
Ubisoft sent its development team in Montreal back to the drawing board and basically told them to start from scratch, which, with the benefit of hindsight, seems like a really bad idea. Right from the start, Ubisoft Montreal knew it wanted to do something a little different with Conviction. It felt that Chaos Theory was the peak of the shadow-based stealth system it had created and didn't see how it was possible to significantly improve on that. The team wanted to try something a little different, and based on their success with the previous two Splinter Cell games they worked on, they'd earned the right to take a risk. Instead of shadows, the stealth of Conviction would be about hiding in plain sight. Levels were going to be crowded, and if Fisher stood in a group of people, he would be effectively hidden from view. The park map showed off at E3 had 250 civilians and 30 enemies. There would have been plenty of places to hide. This may sound familiar to fans of Assassin's Creed, and in fact the systems planned for Conviction had a lot in common with Ubisoft's more junior, at the time, stealth series. In addition to crowds, Fisher would have been able to blend in by using payphones, admiring tourist attractions and sitting on a bench. Comparisons to the Hitman games also aren't far off the mark. Ubisoft Montreal wanted the environment to be dynamic, so Fisher had to be able to interact with items, potentially picking them up and throwing them, knocking them over, or even using them to barricade doors. The developers used the Havoc middleware for the physics, however there was still a lot of work to be done around these new systems, like making sure NPCs reacted appropriately to objects, such as distinguishing between small and large objects heading in their direction. Combined with a more hand-to-hand focused combat system, there were a lot of new animations to work on. I can certainly understand why this new Splinter Cell would have worried fans, but with some fairly notable caveats, I think I would have preferred it to what we ended up getting. First of all, having Fisher go back to basics with a hide-in-plain-sight approach was a perfect setup for where the series was story-wise. If you remember, Double Agent ended with Fisher being forced to kill his boss and close friend Lambert, and then being set up as a murderer and terrorist, forced to go on the run. He's no longer working for a well-funded government organisation in Third Echelon, and he's being hunted. He needs to go off-grid, and from the looks of that demo, that's exactly what he did. Stealth is still clearly an important part of the experience, it's just a different kind of stealth, like taking into account the public's reaction if you were to interrogate an enemy in plain view. The demo showed Fisher waiting until the enemy was out of sight before he did anything aggressive. In an interview, Matthew Furland, a senior producer, described Fisher of the first 4 games as being a basic soldier obey order type, and the team wanted to move away from that. What better time than when Fisher has no boss except himself? What is Fisher like when he doesn't have to follow orders? We've had few chances to experiment with that so far, outside of optional moments in missions like the potential execution of Dahlia Tal or rescuing the pilots against Lambert's orders. To a certain extent, the player would be able to decide what Fisher is really like when he's let off the leash. Does he become more violent when he's not watched by his employer, or does he stick to a non-violent approach when possible? Not because that's what he's told to do, but because that's what he wants to do. Players would also have been able to customise their experience somewhat through a black market vendor that Fisher would use to acquire new technology. In addition to fitting in nicely with the story, this would have been an excellent way to slowly introduce technology and weapons to new players, who otherwise might be a bit overwhelmed jumping in at the deep end with a full kit. It would have let the early missions serve as a natural tutorial. Then as players earned money, they'd be able to pick between non-lethal weapons and gadgets or more deadly options. The presence of this black market vendor makes it sound like the Fisher we saw in the E3 conference was not the Fisher we would have for the entire game, and that at some point he would tech up and be more like the Fisher we know and love. If that wasn't going to be the case, then sure, it could have been bad, but I can't imagine the entire game would have played out like this. From developer interviews, it really sounds like the game would have reacted to player choices in more interesting ways than before. One situation in the demo involved blowing up a propane tank to create a distraction to move a guard away from the door. It certainly gets the job done, although it's a little heavy-handed. Apparently, if you take the noisy approach like this too often, the police will not just search more aggressively, they will eventually withdraw from the area along with all civilians, making it harder to hide in plain sight, and the government would send in Third Echelon, Fisher's former team, to hunt him down. In other words, you'd be making life a lot tougher for yourself. Of course, this may not have worked out in practice. We may have ended up with a Metal Gear Solid 5 situation, where the easiest approach to any scenario always involved headshots with a silenced pistol, regardless of all the options available. There would also have been focus vision, which, as I'm sure you can imagine at this point, would have let Fisher and the player get a clearer idea of what's around them, such as seeing enemies through walls. Despite how cliché such systems have become, it should be noted that this would have been one of the earlier examples, and it's possible the team at Ubisoft Montreal could have taken a soft approach with it, so as not to make it overbearing or an easy mode. On the other hand, I didn't especially like the sound of the switch to shorter missions. The team thought the missions of the earlier games, which generally took about an hour each on the first playthrough, were too long, and they wanted the experience to be something you could jump into and play for a bit in short sessions of around 15 minutes. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about having such short missions in a Splinter Cell game. Actually, scratch that. I am sure, because that's exactly what we ended up getting in the final version and I kinda hated it. Nearly all that work was scrapped in 2007. The story was rewritten, so voice work needed to be recorded again. Some assets were salvaged from the Malta and Washington DC settings, but most missions were designed from scratch. Ubisoft Montreal largely abandoned the stealth approach of hiding in plain sight and instead went with what it referred to as PEV, Prepare, Execute, Vanish. The team wanted to make the game faster and more action oriented and wanted Fisher to be more like a Hollywood action hero, which I don't think any fans of the series were crying out for, but there you go. I didn't see any direct mentions of James Bond or Jason Bourne, although it's clear that's what they were going for. They wanted the player to look and feel like a badass with guns, and they largely nailed that part. It does indeed look very flashy. Conviction ended up being rushed, which is hardly surprising given the upheaval during development, and the release date was pushed back for a March 2010 release. Controversially, Conviction would be an Xbox console exclusive. While there was a PC version, there was no PS3 release nor ports for any other consoles, which was unusual for a series that was so widespread they basically made 2 separate games of Double Agent just to make sure it reached a wide consumer base. As a general rule, I take no issue with exclusives. However, taking a series that was previously available across multiple platforms and then restricting it to one console is not great. The Tomb Raider reboot and Street Fighter V both did something similar. Ubisoft argued that Microsoft's money was crucial to getting the game made, but I don't buy that for 1 second. Sure, Ubisoft wasn't as big back then as it is now, but it was still a huge company that could have easily funded a 5th entry in its hugely popular franchise. Before getting into all the problems around Conviction, I want to highlight what I did enjoy, because Conviction isn't a terrible game as such. If you pick it up on the cheap or play it through the Uplay subscription service, it's a perfectly okay way to pass a few hours. There are far better ways to pass a few hours, mind you, but if you have a burning desire to play all the Splinter Cell games or are just curious, Conviction can provide some light entertainment. First of all, Conviction looks great, at least when it's in colour. I know that's not the most important thing by any stretch, but after the rough as hell Double Agent, it's lovely to see Fisher so well realised, even if he does look and act a little too young. Stealth games rely on their atmosphere, and the visuals are a big part of that. I imagine this will be a bit controversial, but I really like the text on surfaces approach that is used to highlight mission objectives and new locations, plus occasionally Fisher's emotions. Sure, the text is often large and garish, but it tends to be placed in locations you walk past and don't have to stare at for long stretches of time. Occasionally there will even be short movie clips playing on the walls to provide a bit of additional context. I imagine this is especially helpful for new players who might not know who Grimsdotter is, for example. Other UI elements pop up naturally as you look at objects, so if you stare at the middle part of a door you see an option to open the door, and if you look at the bottom you get an option to peek under. With the doors this effect is fine, but it is a bit overused elsewhere. You shouldn't need to mark up every window and ledge that can be climbed, and the constant text appearing on screen can be distracting. The white outline Fisher leaves behind when he's been spotted by an enemy is largely unnecessary, and yet it's another little touch that I actually quite liked. The cutscenes also look really nice this time, and there are a lot of them. Sure, most people don't play Splinter Cell for the story, but it's still nice to see a bit of money put behind cutscenes this time. The return of Fisher's daughter was a big moment, and it was handled well. We also got a flashback to Fisher with Sarah when she was a child, which I asked for in my video on Double Agent. It's quite funny actually, although whether that's on purpose I'm not sure. Fisher is tutorialising stealth for the player by telling young Sarah how to deal with the threat of monsters under her bed.
Here it is. When you're in the dark and your eyes get used to it, you can see all sorts of things around you really well. And then you can do stuff with them.
Like what?
Now take a look at your mobile. You can see it really well, right? If there were monsters standing underneath it, because I can see it, maybe I could make it fall on them and they'd go away.
And it would fall on their heads and they wouldn't be bad anymore?
That's my girl.
I also enjoyed the effects such as sweeping through levels before handing control back to Fisher. I know Michael Ironside has always been incredible as Fisher, but his performance in Conviction is probably his best work in the series. He absolutely knocks it out of the park. While I have a lot of complaints around the lack of stealth options, it should be noted that the shooting elements aren't terrible. I've certainly played worse in more modern cover shooters or cinematic experiences, and I'd take this over, say, The Order 1886. The PEV system leads to some entertaining moments, and the new Mark and Execute system is fun for a while. The Mark and Execute system lets players tag or mark enemies and then perform an execution, which sees Fisher automatically target and kill the tagged enemies. The number of enemies you can tag depends on the weapon and any upgrades you may have acquired, although it's usually between 2 and 4. You can't perform these executions whenever you like. They need to be effectively charged up by performing a melee takedown. In interviews, the developers recognise that such a system is artificial and doesn't make a lot of sense. However, they considered it a good gameplay loop, and I don't entirely disagree. Players often silently take down enemies on the edges of new areas, and this system rewards them with some easy kills later on. Outside of the Mark and Execute system, it's mostly competent. There are a lot of weapons to choose from, although I stuck to a couple of favourites, namely a FAMAS rifle and a good silenced pistol. I'm supposed to be focusing on the good stuff, but I have to point out how annoying the run button is. It's not actually a run button, it's a toggle between walk and run, which I already hate as a system, but the worst is how it interacts with the crouch. If you're crouching and want to make a quick getaway, pressing the shift key or whatever the run button is on your controller will toggle you from run to walk or walk to run depending on what you were last using. So that means if you were running and went dashing into a piece of cover which leaves you crouched, a common scenario obviously, trying to run away will actually see you casually walk away. I don't see why walking can't be the default and then have separate crouch and run buttons. Anyway, back to the positive stuff. Conviction does a good job rewarding the player for whatever approach they take to situations through the points system. The points, which can be redeemed at weapon stashes to upgrade weapons, are rewarded for everything from getting headshots, disappearing from view after being spotted, using the mark and execute system, or simply shooting your way to victory. As you'll see, I don't think there's enough variety of approach, but to the extent it does exist, the game rewards you for whatever you choose to do. Now, as for what I didn't like, let's start with the obvious, and that is of course the lack of stealth. There are two main problems: lack of stealthy options for the route you take from beginning to end of each level, and the lack of stealthy options in terms of gear and equipment. The lack of alternative routes through levels is quite surprising given how open they initially appear. Quite a few of the levels start you outside on city streets with none of those obvious environmental blockages to stop you exploring. However, I soon realised that just because there are no visible blockages doesn't mean they aren't there. If you so much as think about the mere idea of going off the beaten path, you'll hit an invisible wall and be turned back around. I'm not just talking about silly situations where I'm trying to break the game or find the limits of the edge of the world. I'm talking about situations like, I wonder if I can avoid those guards by taking the long route via this alley, and oh no, I guess I can't do that. This is all because of that PEV system. Unlike previous entries, Conviction by design doesn't want you to avoid combat. In fact, it forces the combat upon you. Your only choice is whether you prepare properly by building up the execution meter before going in to execute. To make sure you don't skip combat, Fisher is nearly always funneled through narrow checkpoints with no way to get past short of engaging the enemies. As the developers have stated, the goal is no longer to ghost through levels leaving enemies completely unaware of your presence. You now have to disturb enemies. This is a huge shift. In previous Splinter Cell games, I approached new rooms with the mindset of how do I get to the end unseen. By the time I'd finished with Conviction, that had changed to what's the most effective way to take out all the enemies in this room. That was a deliberate and conscious decision, and I'm slightly surprised the team went ahead with it. The combat first approach becomes all too apparent when you need to interrogate someone. Interrogations used to be largely optional and fairly low-key parts of missions. Occasionally Fisher would be able to get a key code or other bit of information from a random enemy, that kind of thing. Now interrogations are these big set piece events. There are fixed enemies that have to be interrogated, and you can make Fisher bash them against pieces of the environment in scripted ways until they give up information you need to continue. You're restricted to very small areas while all this is happening as well. That's annoying, but that's not the problem. The problem is that to do these interrogations you have to kill every other enemy in the vicinity. No matter how patient you may be, you can't sneak around the back and grab the guy you need to talk to while his mates are still around. Now contextually this makes sense. You can't expect to do those long drawn out interrogations while everyone stands around and watches. However, why were these moments designed in this way? Why have the target be in the open surrounded by guards when he could be in an office, for example, which itself is guarded unless Fisher can find another way in? Or why not let the player drag the target to the shadows and quietly question him, instead of all this bashing his head into televisions nonsense? You could do that in the 2007 version. Some of the areas, like this one just before Fisher breaks into a reservoir, even look set up for you to do just that. The target is at the back of the group and there's a hole in the fence and then a trench to the left. I felt certain this would let me sneak around and grab him, but if you can do that, I sure as hell couldn't figure out how. I looked at a bunch of guides afterwards and they all tell you to kill everyone here. To be fair, the changes weren't done simply because the team wanted to try something new for the hell of it. In a making of interview, the developers talked about how they went back to play the older games, and while they enjoyed them, they actually found them incredibly frustrating due to all the instant fail states. They felt, quite fairly, that being constantly kicked back to a checkpoint ruined part of the experience. I agree. Pandora Tomorrow was probably the worst for this, but all three of the original trilogy suffered in some way from this problem. I get why the developers would want to try something new, and giving the player more combat options isn't a bad idea. I just wish they hadn't taken away so many of these stealth options. You can avoid some combat. Pipes are everywhere now and offer quick and convenient paths to the other end of rooms, likewise with ceilings in offices. However, a big difference is that these paths rarely get you all the way to your goal. It was uncommon to drop down from a pipe and move on to the next part of the level undetected. Instead, it seems like the main goal of these routes is to let you get the drop on enemies via the death from above moves, which then build up your execution meter. In other words, it's part of the prepare section of PEV, not the vanish section. I said that you're forced to engage with the combat, but that's not quite accurate. Many of the encounters are broken in that you can easily just throw down a flashbang or an EMP grenade and run through to the next checkpoint. On normal difficulty you can survive for quite a while when running, and even on hard it isn't impossible. This isn't even cheesing or cheating either. This approach is encouraged early on when Fisher is tasked with retracing his steps through a fairground full of enemies, but is given a load of EMP grenades and basically told to throw them and run, so that's what I did. You don't need to worry about how many times Fisher gets spotted either, and to hammer that point home, Ubisoft Montreal basically removed every stealth tool Fisher had access to in the previous games. When I said that Conviction added combat and removed stealth, I was not exaggerating. Here's a little list of things you cannot do or use in Conviction. You can't move bodies. The developers wanted to include this, but there wasn't enough time, and they correctly figured that it didn't really fit into the game anyway. That's true because the pace is so quick and there's no time or point to hiding the bodies. There's no night vision or thermal vision. You get a special sonar vision near the end, which is helpful for seeing enemies through walls and spotting lasers. However, it's of limited use this late on. You don't need night vision because another thing that's been removed is, well, darkness. Fisher can no longer whistle to attract enemies, and he doesn't have that noise gun thing he had in Double Agent. That one is no loss. Fisher can no longer hide under desks and the like, nor can he do his split jump. To be fair, that last one was nearly always pointless anyway. There are no air ducts to crawl through and no non-lethal weapons such as the airfoil rounds. Fisher can no longer turn off lights for a short period with the attachment on his pistol. Strangely, most light switches can't be interacted with either. There's no lock picking or hacking anymore, so a door is either locked or it's not, and there's no need to use computers anyway. Your only options at doors are to open them or peek under them, with a bash sometimes being available depending on the context. And that peeking under the doors thing is weird as hell. Now that Fisher's not a third echelon agent, he doesn't have access to their toys like the optic cable. Instead he breaks a mirror off a car and uses that. Except there's a reason he needed a thin optic cable to do this before. Look at this clip and explain to me how the hell he has shoved his entire hand and the mirror under the door like this. How big are the gaps under doors here? I know Americans have that weird thing with massive gaps under toilet doors, but these are normal ones, and this just isn't how mirrors work. If I had to single out one change to sum up the entire attitude taken towards stealth and Conviction, it would be a relatively minor one, and that's the removal of the ability to pick up and throw bottles, cans, bricks and other small objects. Without this ability, you can't get guards to move away from the area they are guarding, short of creating a disturbance by shooting something, which carries a significant risk of being caught. You can maybe make some noise with the sticky cameras, but you're limited in how many you have. Throwing bottles might not seem like a big deal, and it's not something I did a lot in previous games because there were other tools and options. However, not being able to do this is an obvious way of stopping the player manipulating enemy AI and instead forcing that direct assault. I really tried to take a stealthy approach to Conviction, but you just straight up can't, and I recommend you don't try. My experience on my first playthrough was all the worse for it. I generally hate the phrase, "you played it wrong." It's one of the fanboy defences and used to block criticism that the person saying it doesn't want to hear. It's rarely true, and even when it arguably is, I'm always far more interested in the reasons why someone played it wrong. Believe it or not, critics don't generally go into games with a view to having the worst possible experience. Most of them try to engage with the games on their own terms and see what they have to offer. However, some games are better than others at communicating what you're supposed to do. And if someone does play the game wrong, I'd much rather look at the reasons why and the failings of the game in teaching the player, rather than immediately jump down the player's throat. Conviction presents an unusual case because having looked through the early missions again, I can't claim the game doesn't teach you how it wants to be played. It doesn't pretend you can be a ghost. It encourages you to use the mark and execute system. It gives you far more noisy guns than quiet ones. And as discussed, there aren't non-lethal options. Conviction tells you how you should play it. Now look, you know I'm not going to entirely accept the blame for this, so I will say that maybe if a game is going to completely change everything about its identity on the 5th entry, it perhaps needs to not just teach new players what it's about, but also force existing players out of old habits, and in my case it didn't do that. I think Bloodborne is an excellent example of this. It does give you a shield early on, but it tells you not to use it. It's clear from that moment that this game ain't another Dark Souls. Once I properly engaged with the game, and in particular the mark and execute system, I had a better time. Still not an especially good one, but a better one. While the mark and execute system takes control away from the player, there is still some skill in marking up the right enemies before, say, dropping down on another enemy to build up your execution meter and then immediately downing the other enemies around you. Conviction's preferred playing style really hit home for me in a room with 3 enemies. One of them goes off on its own and can be easily killed, which builds up your execution meter. Executions are always good for at least 2 enemies, and there happens to be 2 more here. Nice and easy. However, I wanted to ghost through this room undetected, and there are a lot of windows which conveniently take you past the guards and let you head on your way. Or at least they did once. Every other time I tried it, the guards spotted me jumping through the window. They aren't all that bright, so you can still shimmy around the windows and move on to the next section easily enough if you like. However, the point was made. I wasn't supposed to ghost through here, I was supposed to prepare, execute and vanish. Speaking of windows, the guards are extra dumb in these situations and you can just hang on to ledges and wait for them to come to you for easy kills. I cleared out entire rooms this way. Another major letdown is the story. Yes, I know I said the cutscenes were good and the storytelling is the best it's ever been, however the story it is telling is not good. That's a significant distinction. Conviction starts with Fisher on the hunt for the man who killed his daughter Sarah, which happened off screen early in Double Agent. Grim's daughter gets in touch and says that she is now working directly for the President and not Third Echelon, and wants Fisher's help investigating the new director of Third Echelon, Tom Reed. Fisher is reluctant to get involved, but Grim's daughter teases him with information on his daughter's death, which is a dick move, but it works. Fisher and Grim's daughter uncover links between Reed and a private militia called Black Arrow. Black Arrow is owned by a man called Galliard who recently acquired an R&D lab which is developing EMPs, electromagnetic pulses. Under interrogation, Galliard reveals that an organisation known as Megiddo is behind a scheme to detonate 3 EMPs in Washington DC, which would shut down the city and give the Black Arrow's militia the chance to break into the White House and kill the president. This would obviously benefit the Vice President, who is working with Reed at Third Echelon to pull the whole thing off. Reed's motivation is power. The President plans to shut down Third Echelon following Lambert's death, so Reed wants to prove Third Echelon is still required by killing the President and framing Fisher. There was no way for Reed to know Fisher would be at the White House, mind you, and he nearly wasn't, bearing in mind Reed shot down the helicopter he was on. But anyway. The story is only remotely interesting thanks to the links to Fisher's daughter Sarah. Grim's daughter eventually reveals that Sarah is alive after all. Lambert faked her death because he knew there was a mole in Third Echelon and he knew that mole would use Sarah against Fisher at some point. That mole of course turns out to be Reed. The story is functional at best, but more likely kind of a mess, which is a shame because as I mentioned before, some real effort has gone into the production this time, and I loved the framing device. Between missions, the story is told by Victor Costa, who is being held captive by Black Arrow after the events of the game. Costa is an old friend of Fisher's from their time in Iraq, and he helps rescue Sarah and destroy one of the EMPs. Costa talks about Fisher almost as if he's a legend. You can hear the respect and awe in his voice as he reminisces about what happened. This framing absolutely pays off with the ending. I'll let it play out, however for context we saw Costa rescue Fisher earlier, and he stated that you never leave family behind. And then of course Fisher rescues his daughter because Fisher too will do anything for family.
He told me that he and Sarah were going to take some time to catch up. He talked about learning who was really important to you, why you always had to come back for him. He talked about family. And you know what the last thing he said to me was, just before he hung up? Vicky said, "Thanks for everything. I love you like a brother." Brother, that's family, right? Yeah. I thought so.
I love that scene and it's an incredible way to end the game. Shame the quality wasn't that high throughout. The story around Sarah is generally good. Fisher's reaction when Grim's daughter tells him Lambert gave the order to fake her death was spot on. You can see him go through a lot of conflicting emotions, and the level ends with Fisher walking out of the building like an absolute badass with unlimited mark and execute, so all the player has to do is hit fire. It's a great moment. Unfortunately I don't buy the rationale behind faking Sarah's death. Yes, there was a mole in Third Echelon, but surely Lambert, Grim's daughter and others have people they care about who could have been used for blackmail. Why is it only Fisher and Sarah who are at risk for this? And of course the simple option would be to fake Sarah's death, but, well, tell Fisher about it. Instead, Lambert decides to put his best friend through hell to potentially prevent a problem that may never happen. Just tell Fisher she's had to go into hiding for a bit. Lambert was worried what might happen to Fisher if Sarah was threatened, but with her dead he ended up doing some fairly dark deeds in Double Agent. I can never shake the feeling that two different writers had different visions for what happened to Sarah and didn't sort things out beforehand, which is of course almost certainly what happened. Grimm's daughter gets a rough deal here too. She's unnecessarily secretive with Fisher for reasons that serve only to make the player doubt whose side she's really on. Her actions aren't consistent with her character. And why is she now working in the field for the president? And why do they need Fisher's help? Are you telling me the president doesn't have other resources to call on? Another niggle that I couldn't shake involved the Third Echelon agents who are apparently all evil now. Reed was a mole within Third Echelon, but it turns out everyone there was ready to assassinate the president at the first opportunity anyway. With Fisher largely working by himself, he can't afford fancy private jets to fly him to exotic locations all over the world, so it makes sense that most levels take place in one location, namely Washington DC. I'm fine with that. There's still room for plenty of variety, and there's a decent chunk here with levels in the park, by the Washington Monument, in a fair, on the streets, and in the White House. I'm sure the decision to have most levels be in Washington DC was at least partly due to the late change in direction and subsequent shortage of time, but that doesn't mean it was a bad decision. Also, I have a soft spot for games that take place in DC because I used to live there, and frankly it's nice to be able to spend time in DC without sweating profusely in the horrendous humidity. Seriously, if you ever plan to visit DC, don't go there between April and October, and be careful of heavy snowfall in winter. Basically November and March are the only months I recommend. Anyway, what I'm not so happy with is how short the levels are. This was part of the plan for the 2007 version, however Ubisoft was also promising more missions to make up for them being shorter. Instead there's just 11, which is about the normal number, and they are short, really short. Bear in mind what I said earlier about how I approached that first playthrough. I was trying to be stealthy even when the game wouldn't let me. I was trying to find stealth routes that didn't exist. When I got caught I would let myself get killed because I was determined to find the right way to do something. In other words, I was a long way from playing optimally. Despite all that, my first playthrough came in at 5.5 hours. A couple of missions were in the range of 10 to 15 minutes. And again, that is not in any way an attempt at a speedrun. Just casually playing through the game, I was able to finish levels in 10 minutes, and that includes cutscenes by the way. The best example is probably that level in the amusement park. Fisher is tasked with discreetly taking out 3 guards who are watching Costa, who you in turn are supposed to be meeting. You need to do this out of view of the public, which makes this one of the few levels that requires stealth, and also seems to borrow heavily from that original 2007 version. Once you've done this, you're free to meet up with Costa, and then all goes wrong. The public is evacuated and the park is full of enemies, and you need to make it back to the start of the level to reach your getaway car. This could be challenging, except this is that time you're given loads of EMP devices and told to go nuts, so you just spam them and run back. Another short level has you spying on a meeting between Galliard and Reed, which requires Fisher to walk into a construction booth without any need to be stealthy, and then fiddle with the cameras for a bit. Galliard is killed while Fisher is interrogating him, and there's a scene where we chase the killer. After this, Fisher is tasked with surviving waves of enemies. I thought I might be able to complete this just by remaining hidden the entire time, but it appears you actually do have to kill them all. Why on earth is Splinter Cell now a wave-based shooter? One of the interviews with an Ubisoft Montreal developer noted how the team was keen to add moments like this to keep things varied, which was in direct response to feedback from players of Assassin's Creed who felt the whole thing was a bit too samey. That desire to mix things up is the only justification I can think of for the inclusion of a level where you play as Costa tasked with rescuing Fisher in Iraq during the infamous Highway of Death mission that was in the news last year when Call of Duty Modern Warfare made a complete hash of it and refused to acknowledge America's role in a war crime. This level was a shocker. Costa doesn't have any of Fisher's gadgets or skills, not that he has many in this game, so you simply push forward shooting all the enemies in your way. I said earlier that Conviction wasn't terrible as a shooter, but I meant in the context of hiding and shooting with an element of tactics. This is just a shooting gallery and it feels horrible. Weirdly, Conviction still has some of the hiding in plain sight mechanics that featured in the 2007 version, except they do not come close to being useful here. At the beginning of the second level, I noticed that if Fisher moved close to a crowd of people, the screen would turn black and white to indicate that he was hidden by the crowd. Except there are no enemies close here, and there are no more opportunities of note to do this. It just seemingly got left in as a feature from the old game. And speaking of that black and white effect when you're hidden, well, I'm not sure who thought it was a good idea to take this fairly good looking game and make you spend most of your time playing in black and white, but I can confidently say it was not a good idea. I don't mind visual effects like this on screen at times. Many games use blood effects on screen or even black and white to indicate low health, and that is perfectly fitting. It's also notable that you aren't generally expected to be at low health much of the time. The screen effect is therefore relatively rare and impactful. In Conviction, you spend much of your time wanting to hide, and therefore wanting the game to become less visually appealing, which is just weird. The black and white effect also highlights another problem, which is that Fisher is now either in complete darkness or he's not. There aren't any stages in between. This makes it really hard to know exactly when you're safe. For one thing, it's hard to make out Shadow when the screen is black and white, which means it's easy to leave Shadow accidentally, and if you're in light you can't always tell when you will enter darkness. I appreciate that Ubisoft Montreal thought it had gone as far as it could with the Shadow stealth system, but the system wasn't removed or replaced. The stealth system in Conviction is still technically based on shadows. In seeking to change the system, Ubisoft Montreal ended up keeping it and making it worse. As always with the videos in this series, I can't discuss the multiplayer because, well, I can't play it. There's no spies and merc system this time around, and it doesn't sound like I'm missing out on much. I'd like to have played the co-op mode though. In that mode you play through new missions that form a prologue to the events of the main story. Sounds interesting. Overall, Conviction is not horrible for the short time it lasts. However, it's not all that special either. To be clear, because I know people will say otherwise, this isn't a case of it's a good game, it's just not a good Splinter Cell game. If you remove all expectations that come with the Splinter Cell license and engage with the game as it wants to be played, then it's a serviceable enough cinematic style third-person shooter that would have been quickly forgotten without a license attached. And I really don't mind developers wanting to make changes to the Splinter Cell series. It probably should change with the times. The night vision goggles are genuinely iconic, but get rid of them if it helps achieve a different vision. Throw out all the tech and do something completely new. However, if you're going to throw stuff out, you need to replace it with something equally engaging. Conviction removes nearly all the stealth elements from the previous games and replaces it with a mark and execute system that automates shooting for you. That's not enough. Alright, that's it from me today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and consider a sacrifice to the YouTube algorithm god by leaving a comment. I do have a Patreon where you can get your name in the credits and a Patreon role in my Discord server for just $1 a month. So if you'd like to go the extra mile, that would be appreciated. There's just one more video in the Splinter Cell series and then I'm on to something new. Before covering Blacklist, I will likely return to the isometric CRPG series with Shadowrun. Thanks for all the comments in the Witcher DLC video on the new games you want me to cover. I have a few good ideas now, but feel free to let me know in the comments here if there's anything you want to see covered in the future. Please bear in mind my general tastes and preferences though. I'm not likely to suddenly start covering Nintendo games, for example. And I'm already going to cover Divinity Original Sin, Disco Eternity and the like as part of my isometric CRPG series, so no need to suggest them. Alright, until next time, cheers.